Yachats comments. You never cease to amaze me as far as audience. It's actually a beautiful night out here tonight. We're glad you're here, though. We don't have the flyers ready for the next couple of events, but I'll just tell you what they are. Dr. Woody Monte used to have a house here in Yachats on Gender Creek. Now he divides his time between Depot Bay and New Zealand, half a year each place. He taught at the University of Arizona, and he did a lot of interesting research into artificial sweeteners. This is another example of what the corporations don't tell us, but the ingredient aspartame is responsible for a lot of preventable diseases, and it's in all of your sweeteners. There's on the floor right now. Splenda. Anyway, that'll be an interesting one. If you're a regular user of these products, you definitely need to hear what he has to say. One of our board members, Dave Baldwin, organized a community baseball game a couple of years ago. At that game, or after the game, a gentleman came up to him and said, I'd like to be on the Academy Series. I have a good program to present. So Dave followed up on that. He's a psychoanalyst from Denver, Colorado. He and his family vacation out here every summer. So we have him scheduled for July 22nd, that's a Tuesday, Dr. Michael Moran, and his topic will be war. What is it good for? Psychological causes of war. I think we need to learn something about that. Seeing that we're just getting out of a 14-year war and maybe into another one. I would like all the members of the Academy Board to stand up so you can see them. You see me every program, but you don't see the rest. We have Prue Warren and Shelly Naomi Urban, Sherry Capron, and Tom Kearns in the back. If you have any suggestions for a program, see one of these people, talk to them, or come to one of our meetings. We meet the third Wednesday, 3 o'clock, right over here in room 8. But we're open to suggestions. Tonight's program came as a suggestion of Naomi Urban. When I first saw Steve McQuiddy's picture, I said, I think I recognize this guy. Well, he teaches at Lane Community College. He's an author. And he's lived in the area between Corvallis and Eugene for the last 30 years. So he was a patron of our coffee house, New Morning Coffee House on the corner there 15 years ago. Anyway, this is a fascinating subject. I had the opportunity to talk with a lady who was doing similar research. It's taken Steve McQuiddy 20 years to pull all this information together and publish his book, Here on the Edge. Now, I had a question for him, wondering why Yachats doesn't get mentioned, only Walport. Then it dawned on me that 1940s, 44, 45, 46, Yachats wasn't. It wasn't even incorporated yet. So Walport it was a town, it was a village, and Yachats was really a village then. I mean, just a few little cabins and maybe 200 people. 200 people. So we've really expanded now all the way to 600. So. Steve McQuiddy and his wife Debbie. Debbie will be sitting at the table, will be more than happy to take your money, and Steve will be more than happy to sign his book, Here on the Edge. This is a fascinating story of what a small group of men and women, the influence they had on a whole society, starting in the late 40s and going all the way to present day, actually. They're still runoff from what they created. So please give a warm welcome to Steve McQuiddy.
Go ahead and stick that in there. You guys all hear me all right? Okay. I'm going to extemporize for just a second. Well, actually, I'm a teacher, so I extemporize all the time. But he mentioned, upcoming talk, war, what is it good for? And that's something that I have found myself asking quite a bit. And I'm not a conscientious objector. This is a story about conscientious objectors, but I'm not writing from the inside. I was a couple years too young for Vietnam, and I'm a couple decades too old for the current wars. And but I found myself, people have asked me, are you a conscientious objector? Would you have been? And the answer, of course, is really the only one I can come up with, which is I don't know. But I have really examined how I might have felt about it. I was old enough to remember Vietnam very well. My older brother did get a high draft number, and we were very thankful at dinner one night. It was the first time in my life I ever saw my father cry. And there was a guy down the street who got a very low draft number, and he immediately enlisted, and 6 months later he was dead. So it was, very real for us. And so when people ask me, what is it about this conscientious objection? I say, if I'd gone to Vietnam, I probably would have gone, but I wouldn't have been too happy about it, And what I found as I researched this book over the years, I'm going to show you a picture in a little bit, and I never set out to write a book about conscientious objection. I saw a photograph of a man in 1944, and I thought, this guy's fascinating, I got to write about him someday. And it ended up turning into a much deeper, much more complex and complicated story that went on and on and on. And I ended up meeting people and finding out that a number of people had set out to write this book, and they couldn't make it happen. And then once I really delved into the various strands, the bits and pieces that were scattered all over the country and all over decades, I realized, this is why nobody wrote it before. But what I found over the years, as I delved deeper and deeper into the story, I could not ignore those deep, profound questions about war and peace, and the complicated and complex role that each of those ideas play in our society. And so I have found myself changed profoundly by researching and writing this book. How I approach potential conflict, how I deal with views that are clearly at odds with my own. And so let me share with you a little bit about what I learned over this journey. I have to signal. We don't have a long enough cord, so my wife Debbie is going to be hitting these. I think we all know what happened on December 7th, 1941, right? So what happened is right after, here on the West Coast, does anybody remember? Was anybody here during that time? I knew there were going to be some people here, so some of the things I'm going to show you, you might very well recognize and know a whole lot more about it than I do. Okay, so in the days after, what had happened is the entire West Coast went on high alert. And there were nightly blackouts, and bridges and buildings went under immediate guard, not only by the military, but by the local police. Up in Portland, there's amazing stories on how the local labor unions all said, we're ready to go, just give the word. The local parent-teacher organization in the whole Portland area, they said, we got 25,000 members across the state of Oregon. Say the word, we're ready to serve. Everybody was ready to go. And the Weather Service stopped giving weather reports of the tides and the weather. People were told to look out for sabotage and suspicious characters, and there could be somebody who might be carrying a pack of matches with bad intent. And I mean, it was really something going on. So what happened right here on the coast? How many of you have heard of the Tillamook Guerrillas? This is a Newswire story from early 1942. Siuslaw Rifles? No? These were local militia groups. They got together, and this was right after Pearl Harbor, in the months right after, and they said, yep, we're ready to go. And they ran from Florence to Tillamook Bay, and the Yachats Bay News, which was the paper at the time, and they wrote, I quote, "The spirit behind the guerrilla bands is typical of the spirit of the whole American people, still willing to fight hard for their liberties, just as their ancestors did in 1776. And the quote that came with this Newswire photo says, their agreeable expressions might quickly change for enemy invaders. Well, they called them airships back then, and they weren't over the football fields. They were going up and down the coast, and they were searching out any particular suspicious activities. There was a whole lot of search and rescue missions going on as well, because as the Navy and the Navy planes and the boats were doing their training and their preparation, there were various accidents and problems with live ordnance, as you might imagine, and there were search and rescue missions with the blimps as well. Some of the local fishing boats, they were outfitted, retrofitted, turned into towboats and other military service as well. Anybody know the Johnson Lumber Company up in Toledo? I was speaking up at Toledo High School about a month ago, and a young man says, my great-great-grandfather founded the Johnson Lumber Company. And apparently it had burned sometime in the 80s or 90s, if I heard correctly. So they retrofitted the boats, got them ready to go. And so people who were too old or unfit for military service at the time, many of them were World War I vets, and they said, yeah, we're ready. And so here they are in formation, the Lincoln County Guerrillas. And this is, I don't know exactly the specific location, but it's somewhere between here and Newport. And there they are in the Victory Formation. And as a little side note, I'll just share with you because it's so local. The man standing right behind the front, the man on the left, the second one on the left, and he looks like he's wearing a religious clerical collar. It's my understanding that he was a World War I veteran, and he was the leader of the Sayuslar Rifles, and he was blind. And he had been blinded in World War I. And so, but he had that experience, and apparently he was quite a charismatic character. They even had attack dogs. And they had the dogs and the guns, and they were patrolling the beaches day and night. So as I understand it, you did not want to be on the beach after dark without permission. And so that's what was going on right after Pearl Harbor, well into 1942, when I think most of us who are familiar with the history, it wasn't until after the Battle of Midway that people were pretty confident what the outcome of the war was going to be. And people were very worried about invasion and other problems. Well, not everybody wanted to fight in the war. And this is the photograph I saw 20 years ago that started me on this journey. And I saw this photograph in the University of Oregon archives. Keith Richard, anybody know Keith Richard, the retired University of Oregon archivist? Marvelous, marvelous person, became a real resource. He showed me this photograph, and I said, I gotta write about this guy someday. I knew nothing about any camp, any conscientious objectors, anything at all. Well, he was a poet, and he wrote literally hundreds of volumes of poetry. He was a champion basketball player in college at the Missouri State College, as it was called at the time. When he was drafted and became a conscientious objector, he chose to turn down his government-sponsored bus ticket, and he walked 300 miles to his first camp from Missouri to Arkansas. And after the war, he single-handedly created a folk art school for adults based on the philosophies of the 19th century Danish educator Nikolai Grundtvig. Anybody know Grundtvig? No? I didn't know either, right? So I looked him up. He was kind of sort of imagine a Montessori school for adults. That's kind of what it was like. Mixing art into everything that we do. And so Caulfield did this. When he was 45 years old in 1960, he enrolled at the University of Oregon in graduate school, which was really quite unusual at the time. Well, his name was Glenn Caulfield. None of us have ever heard of him. I never did until I started doing this. Bill Everson. Some of you might recognize this name. Well, Bill Everson was a poet, and he was a farmer down in the San Joaquin Valley, just south of Fresno. And he always figured that he would end up being a farmer. He was born into it, but he liked to write poetry as well. And after the war, he ended up in Berkeley. And he set up a fine press printer there, and he printed a lot of his own books, and he got involved with a number of people who were doing a lot of creative work at the time. But he was a very spiritual person, and he was always examining his relationship to God or whatever his perception of God might be. So he decided to become a monk in the early 1950s, became what's called a lay monk, which is he lived very much like a monk, but he did not have the same powers, as it were, to perform certain services. And he did that for about 18 years, and then in 1969, at a public reading, he was still giving poetry readings. At a very public reading in Davis, California, he announced that he would take off his cloak, renounce his vows, and he did. And then he walked away with a woman 30 years his junior and married her the next day. Yes, sir.
During those years, if you're looking for his poetry, he wrote under the name of Brother Antoninus.
Yes, exactly. Brother Antoninus, they called him the Beat Friar because he knew the beat group there. Yes, yeah. Which marvelous poetry, by the way. Thomas Merton and Brother Antoninus. If you're interested in Christian poetry, it's wonderful stuff, really. Yeah, thank you. Mm-hmm. Next is Kermit Sheets. This guy's great. Kermit Sheets was a lover. He loved women, he loved men, he loved art, music, printing, theater, all creative things. He loved life. And after the war, he went down to San Francisco as well, and he founded the Interplayers Theater Group, which was a groundbreaking repertory theater group in San Francisco that really opened the door for a lot of what happened there in the 50s and 60s. He also founded an organization called the Centaur Press, which I found out was the press that was originally going to publish Anais Nin's diary. And then I actually have seen the letters that Anais sent to Kermit, and she was apologizing. She had agreed to do it, but then somebody in New York offered her more money, and she had to take it. So that's how she got her diary published. And Kermit also was involved in film with his partner at the time, a fellow named James Broughton. Some of you might know Broughton or Broughton. And Kermit told me it's pronounced Broughton. Excuse me. And they put together an experimental film that won a special award in the 1951 Cannes Film Festival. Adrian Wilson, he wanted to be a writer. He ended up being one of the most accomplished fine printers ever. From his studio in San Francisco after the war, the press at Tuscany Alley, he put together fine printing books for the Limited Editions Club, the California Book Club, and private clients as well. And he wrote a book called The Design of Books in the 1960s, and it's considered to this day the standard in the field. And he also was awarded one of the very earliest MacArthur Genius Grants in 1983. And that's the MacArthur Genius Grant. I think most of us might know what that is. If not, that's where somebody calls you up with no announcement whatsoever and says, "Hi, we really like the work you've done in your life. Here's $1 million. Do with it what you will." And that's what they did in 1983. I think it's still $1 million. Does anybody know? Have they upped it? Well, so he had his $1 million. Clayton James. Clayton James was an artist who came from the East Coast, and he came out west and he never looked back. He, after the war, ended up in the Puget Sound country. He was up there with the Pacific Northwest mystic painters, Morris Graves, Mark Tobey, Kenneth Callahan. Clayton was a sculptor, and he has become internationally known. He's still alive. He's 95, might be 96 this year, I'm not sure. And he's still living in the house that he bought in 1950 up there. He was known not only for his very simplistic, very basic sculptures, but also for his absolute devotion to his privacy. And it took me literally about a year and a half of phone calls and emails to talking with a local woman who has sort of become his caregiver. Before I actually could spend 2 hours with him one afternoon in an interview. So Kemper Nomlin, he was an architect from down in Los Angeles. So he's down, and so he's an architect. He also liked to draw, and he drew all kinds of things. And in one particular documented case, which is hilarious, he was up at Cascade Locks, which was a CO camp up there. And he made a line drawing, simple line drawing, and they put it in a mimeographed literary journal that they mailed out to the camps around the country. And it was a drawing of a nude woman. And it was declared obscene by the Postal Service, and they destroyed almost all of the copies of the journal. And if you were to see it today, it's so tame by today's standards. What's interesting is the same journal had a drawing of a nude man, anatomically correct, and that didn't seem to bother anybody. It had a long poem called Love Cycle, and it was a homosexual love poem. That didn't seem to bother anybody. But there was something about this drawing of the woman, and that's what they decided to destroy it. After the war, he became a prize-winning architect in Southern California. Claude Dupre, he insisted he had no talent as an artist, but he really loved being around artists. So when he was trying to get to the camp I'm going to tell you about shortly, he says, "I'm no artist, but my fiancée is a great actress. So we're going to get married, and she's going to come live out here. So can I come join your group?" So they let him come along. Before World War II, as a young man in New York City, he was very involved in anti-war activities. He worked for the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which is a peace group that was created just around the World War I era. And he also had a few friends. He would go to the jazz clubs in New York City. He's 19 years old, and he was good friends with Bayard Rustin, who's one of the pioneers of the Civil Rights era. And a friend of theirs would go up and sing for a while on the stage, and then she'd come and sit down with them and have a drink. Billie, that was her name. Billie Holiday, yes. Bill Eshelman, he also liked theater and printing and all kinds of creative activities. And he was a young man who really wanted to get involved in education as much as possible. So after the war, he enrolled in, studied with the librarian Lawrence Clark Powell. Anybody know about him? Lawrence Clark Powell, he made the UCLA collections what they are today. Yeah, if you go down and you can see some of the most amazing work that is at the UCLA Clark Library, that's from Lawrence Clark Powell. He made that happen. So Bill Eshelman studied with him, and after the war, he got involved in quite a few things. He was very active in civil rights, academic freedom, all the big issues of the 50s and 60s. And he became the editor of the Wilson Library Bulletin and also one of the early presidents of the Scarecrow Press. Yes, there were women too. Now, Madge Langley, she was not a CO, of course, because they weren't drafting women into the war at the time. Well, Madge grew up in Portland in the 1920s, and she was born in the late teens. And when she saw photographs and sometimes actual people of some of the men returned from World War I, and she saw what it had done to them, not just physically, but also mentally and spiritually, she swore as a very young girl, she said, "I could never, ever support a war." So when World War II came along, she knew that she couldn't get involved in it. So she decided that she was going to support the conscientious objectors as much as possible. So she became what they called the CO's USO girl. Okay, and USO was the United Soldiers Organization. That's the entertainment for the soldiers. So she decided that she was going to support the conscientious objectors as much as she could, which of course added up to what were women allowed to do at the time? Oh, secretarial work, maybe some kitchen work, things like that. So she did a lot of administrative work and helped to keep people's spirits up as best she could. Okay, what all these people have in common is a camp. And that's Camp 56, Civilian Public Service Camp number 56, also known as Camp Angell with 2 L's, Camp Angell with 1 L, and in some circles also known as Camp Walport. And as Don pointed out earlier, while it is actually closer to us here in Yachats, it was called Walport because that was where the closest incorporated area was. So all of the mail went to Walport, and the identification was there. So this was, you guys all know where Camp Angell is? I don't want to make an assumption. It's just a couple miles up the road. It's still there today. They're part of the Northwest Job Corps. And it was originally, do you guys know it was originally a CCC camp? Yeah. And it was built in November of 1941. And they were getting ready to put some people in the CCC camp, and then December 7th happened. So it never opened as a CCC camp. It just sat there empty for about a year until it opened as civilian public service a year later in late October of 1942. Well, this was one of 150 work camps across the country. And they were set up so that conscientious objectors could do work in lieu of military service. And this was part of, this is what's called, I always get this backwards, it's the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940. That was the first draft, the first peacetime draft order. And this was a law passed by Congress and signed by President Franklin Roosevelt in 1940 during peacetime. And this was the first peacetime draft ever in this country. And so there were, as part of that, the COs would do work of, quote, national importance. And this would be determined by an interagency government organization, and a board was put together called the National Service Board for Religious Objectors, the NSBRO. And the final approval would be sent to the president, and he would decide what the work of national importance would be. So there's roughly 50,000 conscientious objectors during World War II. About half of them were given non-combatant roles or otherwise excused from the service. So that cuts it to about 25. And about half of those, about 12,000 of those, went to work in CPS. I should say very briefly that some people did some pretty extreme work. Some were not in CPS per se. They volunteered to be guinea pigs in medical experiments. Did you know that there were some really quite invasive medical experiments performed on people here in the United States during World War II? Now, I do need to point out there's one big distinction between the horrors that the Nazis perpetrated and what happened here in America. What happened here in America, these were people who consciously, very, very aware, volunteered to do so. A lot of it had to do with, anybody ever hear of the Minnesota starvation experiment? There's actually a book on that. At the University of Minnesota, young men volunteered to starve themselves for like a 6-month period to find out what the effects of starvation would be. They volunteered to drink throat washings of people who had various diseases. They volunteered to be involved in experiments with extreme heat, extreme cold. And, so they wanted to make their contribution to the country. They wanted to prove that they were not cowards, okay? They just did not believe in the war that was going on, whether it be their religion, their political, or their spiritual or otherwise sensibilities. So about 12,000 of them went to work in these camps. And many of these camps were, in fact, originally CCC camps, so they did work very similar. Be in agriculture, soil and water conservation. There was even a camp that did weather research up in Mount Washington in New Hampshire. You know that Mount Washington is the place where the highest speed wind has ever been recorded, 212 miles per hour up in New Hampshire. So they did various things. Depending on where they were at, they were given the different kinds of work. So let's go ahead and show this one. Let me give this to you as concisely as I can. There was actually a time where there was a public-private partnership, and it was unbelievably successful. And it was this. The U.S. government provided the space in the camps. They provided the tools to do the work. They provided the supervisors, whether it be from the Forestry Service, Department of Agriculture, Department of Health, and so they provided that. That was it. The rest was provided by what were called the 3 historic peace churches. Anybody know what they are? Yeah, the 3. So the Friends or the Quakers, the Mennonites, and the Brethren. And they were the 3 historic peace churches, so named for obvious reasons, because ever since they were founded, many of them in about the 1600s, I think, is where most of them began in Europe. they, as one of the basic beliefs of their religion, is that they will never ever participate in war, ever. So what happened is that the leaders of the three peace churches, they went to Roosevelt as war was looming, and they said, look, we know war is coming. We know you're trying to stay out of it. We appreciate that, but we're pretty sure that war is coming. So what we want to do is let you know that the young men in our churches are not going to fight in your war. Okay? They never have, and they never will. There's records of conscientious objection in this country going back to pre-colonial times. And they said, and we know that what happened in World War I is not one of the shining moments in American history. Most of the people in World War I who were conscientious objectors were sent to prison. They were beaten. They were abused in various ways. Some of them were killed. The record of the Civil War is something I won't even get into. I have a whole chapter on that kind of stuff in the book. So what happened is the leaders went to Roosevelt. They said, we know you don't want this to happen again. And so they presented the idea of putting the conscientious objectors in the camp. They said, we got these camps. Let's let them go to work. Let's let them make contributions to the company, to the country. And Roosevelt agreed, and he signed an executive order to make that happen. So here they were doing that. So one of the conditions was Roosevelt and his people. They said, okay, you pay for it. So the three historic peace churches said, okay, we'll do that. And their members paid for the room and board of 12,000 conscientious objectors all over the country. They paid for their clothes. They paid for their food. They paid for everything they needed. It did not cost the taxpayers anything to support these people who were working for free. No pay. 50 hours a week, 6 days a week, 50 to 55 hours a week, 6 days a week. They had Sundays and Christmas Day off. No pay. They were each given a monthly allowance of $2.50 to pay for things like soap and razor blades and toothpaste perhaps, things like that. So their conscription that changed during the course of the war. I won't bore you with all the details about it, but basically it ended up the length of the war plus 6 months is how long they would be in CPS. Okay? Depending on where they were at, that would determine the kind of work they would do. Well, Camp Angell, right here in the heart of logging country, would naturally focus on tree planting. So the Forest Service was their supervisors, and they were planting the Blodgett Tract. Anybody know the Blodgett Tract? Right up here. Yeah, it's 12,000 acres. And it was logged off during World War I. Anybody know why? Spruce trees. I knew you guys would know, right? Spruce trees to do what? To build the airplanes, yeah, because spruce is light and strong. So they went in, they took out just the spruce, and they left the other things behind, cut down only what they needed to get to the spruce. And of course, what happened during the 1930s? The fire swept through. And this is what the camp looked like in the wintertime. And I don't think I need to speak to anybody here what it's like on the coast in the winter. Okay. I will read a very short passage from the book. And I want to share this with you because this is how they encountered the camp. So it was that on October 24th, 1942, Civilian Public Service Camp number 56, also referred to as Camp Walport, Camp Angell with 2 L's, Camp Angell with 1 L, in Lincoln County, a little more than halfway up the Oregon coast, 4 miles south of Walport, 2 miles north of Yachats. I have to get Yachats in there. And a couple of 100 yards inland from the beach, officially opened with 96 members under the administration of the Brethren Service Committee and assigned to do work for the U.S. Forest Service, just in time for the fall rains. Crews were immediately put to work constructing more buildings to accommodate the camp needs, and only to see 2 of them flattened by a storm. The rain was incessant, the mud ubiquitous. The camp newsletter, The Tide, in its first issue, dated November 1942, observed, and I quote, "Where there is smoke, there is fire, and in CPS, where there is rain, there is mud, and that is everywhere. Sorry, I can't read this very well. So having removed the topsoil, when leveling it for the camp, no seeds were left in the exposed earth to start new growth. Hence, no grass, not even a dandelion, grows anywhere. We live in a sea of mud. Well, they spent their time doing a variety of things. Chopping wood, and this is pretty amazing. All the fuel for the camp came from wood. There was a little bit of electricity with generators, but really it was, their phone number was 89. I just love that. That was their phone number, 89. And so the fuel came from wood, of course, right? So they went out there and they got all their wood from snags, all right? And the snags, because they cut down the spruce, left the others behind. The fire came through, left behind the burned snags. They went out and cut the snags. And you can see they've got themselves a little chain operation here. They're cutting the big logs. The guys right behind them are chopping those and throwing them up on the stacks. And this is a photo, I love this. I was talking up in Portland in January, and in a pretty large room, and it was pretty dark out there. There's those old people, and I hear this voice call out, "That's my grandfather!" And it turns out that it was indeed. The photo I got from the Brethren Church archives outside of Chicago. There's no name written on it, and it was here's her grandfather. His name is Wesley DeCursey, and he was a Brethren minister, and his granddaughter, is currently a Brethren minister in Portland. And she recognized her father. And then somebody whistled because, he's a pretty buff guy, right? She calls back, "He's married!" So I had to share that with you. He said, I love this photo, and the reason I use it is because take a look, right? I think most of us have chopped wood, right? And you got your round, and you put your piece on there, and you split, right? But look at what he's splitting. He's not splitting something on top of a big round. He's splitting the round. And I think that's really something because, that takes some muscle power. So they spent the time chopping wood. They crushed rock. They went out and they gathered boulders all around, wherever it was available. They threw them into trucks and they hauled them to a rock crusher operation 5 miles from camp to turn it into gravel, and they poured it out onto the fire roads. And what do you think happened to the gravel? It sunk, you know it, right? It sunk down in the mud. So what they do? They got some more rock, they crushed the rock, and they poured it on there. They said that during the winter months, it'd take them about 2 hours to go 5 miles because the trucks were just ground down. So oftentimes they would go out to their work to do the tree planting. They'd just get the truck as far as they could go, then they just hike. They'd hike it on in. And I'm sure that's probably what some of you have done in the past. So they crushed rock, and they fought forest fires during this dry summer season. And this is early firefighting equipment, as you can see. And they planted trees. They planted almost 1.5 million trees in a year. And that's the Blodgett Tract. And as part of my research and just immersing myself in this book, after I talked with, anybody know Phyllis Steves, the retired lady? Yeah, I know it, yeah. Is Phyllis here? No, okay. She was up at Camp Angell when I spoke up there earlier this year. And I talked to Phyllis right before she retired, a couple years ago, I think it's been now. And she showed me some of the maps of the Blodgett Tract. So I took a drive up there, and the trees are up there today. The trees that they planted, they're 70 years old. And you just go on up there, and you can get to the top of the ridge, and it's just that lovely sound of the wind coming through the trees. So they're there today. So they planted trees, they fought forest fires. Oh yeah, so this is some of the territory they planted. As you can see, there were plenty of snags because they only took the spruce and what was in the way. And the misery whips, they worked on those. And the springboards. Anybody here ever cut with springboards? No? Okay. I was talking to some of the local high schools and asking some of the kids, I says, all right, any of you guys ever use a springboard? And one young man, 16 years old, he says, yeah, we did it. We had an old tree and we were cutting this thing down. So springboards and drag saws. Anybody ever see a drag saw? Yeah. Up at the high school, I got to share this. I think it was Toledo High, and I told them, I said, "This is the grandfather of the chainsaw, right?" And I said, "Well, what do you think that is?" The kid yells out, he says, "It's a giant electric turkey knife." And I thought that was a pretty creative observation, coming from somebody who was born in 1998 or something like that. I thought that was pretty good. And so here they are on break, having their lunchtime. And during my research, I read a lot of letters, diaries. They kept a pretty good record, actually. And once I was able to get to the various sources and put the pieces together, I could, really get a picture of what life was like. And these guys, they kept talking about toasting their sandwiches at lunch. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. All right, you're having, grilled cheese or something? Okay. And so they toast their sandwiches at lunch, and then I found in one letter the reason they did that was to dry them out. And I thought that was interesting. So, for most of these campers, as they were called, all right, they actually, they were referred to as campers quite a bit, which is really interesting because, when I grew up, campers meant Boy Scouts, and I thought, okay, that didn't mean being in a what essentially was a penal colony, and so they were called campers. Well, for most of them, this was actually okay. This was enough. It's important to note that in a camp that had at any given time anywhere from 80 to 120, averaging about 100 people in camp at any time, right? About 80% of these people were strong religious objectors, and they came from very conservative, very old school communities, oftentimes in the Midwest. Many of them had never even left their farms, I found out. They hadn't even gone to town, right? They're 18, 19 years old. They've never left their farms. And so what they did is they came, they did their work, and they saw it as their duty, not just to their country, but to God. And they saw it as their duty. They did their work, and they said, we'll quietly do our work. When they were done doing their work, they got together in the dorms, they read the Bible. That's where they got their education. That was their understanding. Everything was filtered through their understanding of the Bible. So they did their job, they studied their Bibles, they rode home, they went to the services at the chapel and the camp, and they waited until they could go back to their quiet lives. And that was the vast majority of the people in civilian public service. Well, not everybody felt that way. And there were some people who were, a little more creative, and they weren't just satisfied to dig their ditches or plant their trees. They wanted to do something more. And so the group that administered, there were these, what they call service committees, each of the peace churches, and they would actually have an organization within their church that would oversee their group of camps across the country. And the camp we're talking about was overseen by the Brethren Service Committee. And the Brethren headquarters were in Angell, Illinois, just outside of Chicago. And a couple of key figures there, a guy named Harold Rao and the Education Secretary Morris Keaton. And these were very important people because they did see a real opportunity here. And they wanted the people in their camps to be able to do more than just do their time if they wanted. So what they did is they allowed the camps, and they actually nurtured this and supported it, to set up what they called schools, where during their off hours they would do a type of work focused in a particular area. One school focused on education, another on health. Up at the camp at Cascade Locks, east of Portland, they had what was called the School of Pacifist Living. Well, Air Wellport, by fate or chance or whatever, take your pick, right? It just so happened that there was a group of really creative-minded individuals. And here's three of them. This was the core group that started it all. A guy named Harold Hackett, who was a young man who had actually grown up with missionary parents in Japan. And he had an acerbic wit. He was a sharp young guy with a sharp tongue. And there's William Everson, Bill Everson in the middle, looking very poetic. If you look carefully, you'll see a shadow going down across his neck there, from his mouth down to his shoulder on the left. Okay, on his left, our right. That's the shadow of his pipe. I looked at this very closely. He's got his poet's pipe in his mouth there. And the guy on the right is Glenn Caulfield. He's the guy I showed you earlier. As you can see, this is the earlier stages of his hairstyle. Well, what they did is, let's go back. What they did is they not just put in their time, but then they spent their nights writing, printing up their work, and putting together a lot of creative things. They put together a little newsletter they called the Untie. They loved puns. Okay, the official camp newsletter, as I mentioned earlier, was called the Tide. I think for obvious reasons, being right on the coast. So they came up with the Untie, and they loved the puns so much, right down there to the slogan underneath: "What is not tied is untied." They just love this stuff. And as you can see, they enjoyed slug racing. And I researched as much as I could. I did not find any evidence of them actually racing slugs. Although I really do like to think that maybe they gave it a try. And again, I got to share with you with the local high schools. I asked any of the kids. I said, "Any of you do any slug racing?" And a young man, and I don't think he was kidding. He said, "I tried it." I said, "So how'd it turn out?" He says, "Well, I put them next to each other and I watched them for about 5 minutes, got bored, and walked away." So and I really like the creative references. You guys are probably familiar with Mark Twain's the Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, and I think there was a lot of this kind of stuff going on. Well, it started out as really just kind of a lighthearted protest. The Untied lasted for 12 weeks, and they put it together each Saturday night, and they ran it on the mimeograph machine, and they dumped it on tables and in boxes all around the camp, and they mailed it out across CPS. And it was full of all kinds of inside jokes and lots of puns and, making fun of tender egos in camp. And, if that had been all it was, then, it would have just gone into history's dustbin, and that would have been it. But what ended up happening is it ended up growing into a much more serious artistic venture. And this is where Bill Everson was a key factor. He had already been a published poet before the war. So he started printing these single-page poems, and they were on half sheets, and you run the 8.5 by 11 sheet, and you cut it in half, and they inserted them into the Untied. They were called war elegies, and they were shipped out across the CPS network, and they started getting letters back. And so they said, "Hey, let's make it into a book." And this was the first book that they printed, and it was called 10 War Elegies, run on a mimeograph. The cover is done with silk screen. They didn't have much, and they just had the basic primary color inks. And this is the book they put together, and they got orders over the course of a year. They ended up selling 1,000 copies at 10 cents a copy. Now, if you think about it, this is during the war, with all the focus on military, on what was going on overseas, with all the rationing, paper rationing, ink rationing, everything was rationed. And so 1,000 of these pacifist poems got bought all across the country. I mean, if you look at it in context, it's an amazing number. And Bill Everson became recognized as really the premier pacifist poet in the United States. And of course, this is happening in 1943 in the depths of the World War II, which was pretty interesting. So they ended up putting that together, and this grew into an officially sanctioned program called the Fine Arts at Waldport. That was their official name, and they referred to themselves as the Fine Arts Group. And this is the opening page of the Fine Arts Prospectus, which invited people to come across the country and join the group. You were allowed to do that at CPS. These 12,000 COs, they could actually put in to transfer from one camp to another to join the different schools that would suit their interests and talents and abilities. And this became a real center for artists, actors, musicians, and writers. And what they were doing is choosing to take this condition of penance, right, refusal to serve in the military, and put it to creative ends. And their focus was not so much on the current war, but they started thinking, what kind of society might be possible when the shooting finally stopped? And this is what Bill Everson wrote, and this is where I got the title of the book, Here on the Edge. I love this title, and I love talking it up because I didn't make it up. And it's a great title. And what Everson wrote was at the bottom of this piece, he wrote, "Here on the edge, we can only watch and prepare, and bide on the time when what we are, and that for which we have taken this stand, can be tangent again to the world. And what I find really, really deeply profound about this is that these were young men. They were 22, 24. Everson was the old man, and he was 30. They knew they weren't speaking to the current generation. They knew it. They knew they were speaking to the future. But even they could have no idea how what they were doing at that time in this isolated work camp would resonate far, far beyond. Well, they got to work. They found themselves an old letterpress printer in Walport at a secondhand store. Doc Workman. Anybody ever hear that name? Doc Workman. He was an old wobbly from the teens and the 20s, and he came out to Walport in the 30s, and he had a secondhand store. Walport had 600 people, okay? And he had a secondhand store, and he had a letterpress printer that had printed a whole bunch of the newspapers throughout the whole Central Coast and had just been tossed away as not useful anymore. They got it, they cleaned it up, they got to work, and they started printing books. And here they are in the press room, and some of the people I mentioned earlier, that is Vlad Dupre over there on the left with the pipe running the press. He's the guy who said, I got no artistic talent, so they said, okay, run the press. And the next guy in the front, that's Bill Eshelman, who I mentioned earlier, who had studied with Lawrence Clark Powell, and he was really just touching, getting involved in everything. And that's Bill Everson in the background there doing some figuring, and he's got his pipe there as well. And I like the way that there's Ash, as he was called. I actually got to interview him before he died, and he goes by the name Ash. And he's setting type there. He's got the single light bulb, And I think we all know, the kind of work that it takes and the wear that it takes on your eyes doing that. So they were putting these things together. They printed real books, and this is a pretty much a representative collection of what they printed. And again, paper rationing, ink rationing, rubber, fuel, everything being rationed, and they put these books out. Yes, sir?
I have to ask, all the writers were from within? So was Kenneth Patchen also?
No. All the writers were not from within. Yeah, and I'm actually going to talk about that in a little bit. But feel free to ask questions at any time. Absolutely, yeah. And so, these are most of the books that they put together. And I'll be talking specifically about that Patchen book. And I can already sense that some lights are popping in some heads right now. You guys are recognizing something, aren't you? I'll talk about that. And so these are some of the books they put together. And they even started to put on some plays. And if you this is the earliest stages, okay? Midsummer Night's Dream. And I just love this because this is, what do you do when you got nothing? Okay? And what this is this is the play within the play, right? And these are the guys doing the play within the play of Midsummer Night's Dream. The rustics, they were called, right? Peace Blossom and Bottom and those guys, if you're familiar with Shakespeare. And look at their costumes. Sheets, pajamas, and long johns. All right? And they made do with what they had. And here's the audience. All right? Crates and long planks sitting, spread out on the ground right there. And that was their outdoor stage in 1943. Well, as they got more involved and they got more people here, they got more serious about it. And they put together a real stage. And this is an area that they shared with the chapel, actually. And both the chapel and the dramatic events, shared the space. And so this is a dramatic reading. Anybody know John Dos Passos, his USA trilogy, right? It's a story of the first 3 decades of the United States. It's amazing. He's a contemporary of Ernest Hemingway, and highly recommend it. It really changed my life as a young writer when I first read it many years ago. This is a dramatic reading of selections from Dos Passos' USA. And Aria de Capo, anybody know that one? Edna St. Vincent Millay. It was an anti-war play that she wrote in 1919 after World War I, of course. And that on the left is Manch Langley, the woman I mentioned earlier. And that's Kermit Sheets there on the right, who was really a driving force in the theater there. And this is another scene from Aria de Capo. And that's Bill Eshelman there on the left. And Vlad Dupre, who, by the way, is 94 years old, lives down in Davis, has become a dear friend of mine. And he and I talk, pretty regularly. And so there he is in the center, and he insisted he had no artistic talent, right? But they got him to be a non-speaking character in one of the plays. And so he acquiesced. And can't remember the name of the guy on the right, not sure. Anyway, so. And this is, they did Henrik Ibsen's Ghosts. And for those of you who are familiar with Adrian Wilson and how he became really, an incredible printer, this is one of his earliest ever printing attempts. He learned how to print at the camp, the Waldport. And this is one of the very first pieces of printing that he ever did. And if you look at it, you say, oh yeah, whatever. But then you realize, oh wait, this is a genius in the making. And this is some of his earliest work. And they did George Bernard Shaw's Candida. And this is Vlad Dupre's fiancée who became his wife. She is the actress, Ibi Dupre. And she was acting in Candida. And here's a larger scene from it as well. And as you can see, they're pretty sparse, but they made do with what they had. And they built, they put these things together with very, very basic materials. And then they also did Chekhov's The Seagull. And that's one more play. All right, this part, I love this one. This is the tech. Take a look at, all right, how are you going to do your legs? Well, you get yourself a stool there on the left. And you need to raise it up a little bit. You throw a couple books down, and you get yourself an empty can, and you set that thing so it shines on out. If special effects, well, you cut up some cardboard and move it back and forth. That's tech in Waldport or Camp Angell in 1944. And on the right, there's Glenn Evans running the curtain up and down. And so they also put, they had music as well. And they put together a string quartet. And this was started by a guy named Broadus Earl. He was a child prodigy from the East Coast. And he became a conscientious objector, and he came out to Waldport, and he said, we're going to put together a string quartet. So they did. And he played the violin, and Warren Downs, a fellow from Salem, he played the cello, and they had another violinist named Bob Harvey. But wait, you need 4 people for a quartet, don't you? Well, Adrian Wilson, the printer I mentioned earlier, was actually an accomplished clarinetist. And he brought his clarinet, and he would play string parts on his clarinet as part of the quartet. You make do with what you have. Now, we got to remember that they're doing all of this, all right, after working 50, 55 hours a week, 6 days a week, all right, for no pay. And I particularly like to use this photo as a contrast to the earlier one where I showed you they're all sitting there toasting their sandwiches. Well, they're toasting their sandwiches here. If you look close there on the lower right, you'll see some guys toasting their sandwiches. But if you look closely at this photo, nobody's sitting on the ground, right? I think we all know why. Okay. Forward. There we go. All right. Now, I recognize that the people I've been talking about are hardly household names. There are a few who some of you might recognize. Anybody know about Morris Graves? Yeah, I figured a few people would. One of the mystic Northwest painters, Morris Graves, up there in the Puget Sound country, all right? And a good friend of John Cage, by the way. All right, John Cage, the jazz musician. They were good friends. And he was a conscientious objector. He was not assigned to Camp Angell. He was thrown immediately into a stockade outside, and they sent him down, I think, to... I can't remember if it was Leavenworth. It might have been down in California. I'm not sure. Threw him into a stockade for about a year. They tried to break him, break his spirit, break his body, whatever. And he was just so ethereal. They couldn't make any sense of him. So eventually the psychiatrist at the stockade said, look, get out of here. We can't help you at all. And they said, just get out of here. They gave him an honorable discharge. Okay? And so he went back up to the Puget Sound territory. And Clayton James, the sculptor I mentioned earlier, Clayton actually had seen some of Morris's work back in New York at the New York Museum of Art. And so they got in touch with him, invited him to come down, and be a visiting artist at the camp. So he agreed to come down. He drove down along the coast, right? And you can imagine what the roads were like back then, in a Model T. And he came down with his canvases and his paints, and 3 dachshunds were always in his company. And he came down to the camp, but not quite to the camp. They got a letter one day. And he had written to them from Walport, and he said, I am in the area, and I'm checking out the vibrations. And he said, I will soon come visit the camp. So he notified them by letter. So he didn't live in the camp. He did come to visit, and he'd walk around with a little brownie camera around his neck and take pictures all the time, all kinds of stuff. He set up a lean-to about a mile north of the camp. Big Creek. Yep, right, Big Creek. He set up a lean-to right where Big Creek goes down into the sand there. And he set up a lean-to. He had his dachshunds. He built a bed out of moss. And he would take his canvases and lay them out on the ground, and he would lean over them, almost like Jackson Pollock. And he would paint, like moving his, not dripping, but moving his arm around. He said it freed up the motion of his arm. So he was doing his paintings, and they held a show at the camp. And as you can see, his paintings are quite ethereal. If you're not familiar with Morris Grace, it's always about birds and kind of misty sorts of things going on. Very much of the spirit and the mind. And so they had a show, and they actually had paintings for sale, ranging in price from $10 to $20. Which, of course, at the time was a lot of money for the people, particularly if you're working for no pay and you get $2.50 a month to buy soap. That's a lot. And also the people in town, they'd just gone through a depression, so they didn't have a whole lot of money. But still, from the grown, you guys know what we're talking about here, right? 3 years later, his paintings were selling in the tens of thousands of dollars. They discovered him in New York. And there's a Life magazine article from the early 50s called The Mystic Painters of the Pacific Northwest. And, with the internet now, you can see all this stuff. And so he and Mark Tobey and Kenneth Callahan were on the cover and had a full feature done in Life magazine. So, check your attics. Check with the old timers around here. I searched and searched and searched through letters and diaries. I left nothing uncovered. I wanted to find out, did anybody buy a painting? I found no record of it. But check around. I told all the high school kids I've talked to here, I says, talk to your grandparents, your great-grandparents, right? Because one of these things right now, we're talking what? I don't know, 100,000? 500,000? I don't know. A lot. Okay? Yeah, maybe more. Anybody know Bill Stafford? Yeah, William Stafford. He was not at Camp Angell. He was in CPS. If you haven't read his book, Down in My Heart, a thin volume of his memories of his time in CPS, I can't recommend it highly enough. It is an unbelievable testimony to what it's like to actually live your life devoted to peace in a time when that is probably the most unpopular thing you could imagine. And it's a very, very powerful book. It was actually his master's thesis, but it's a marvelous collection of short pieces. So he was down in Southern California at the time, and the group up here actually published some of his earliest poems and some of his short prose vignettes. I've talked to the guys up at Lewis and Clark, did a lot of my research up there. That's where Stafford's, all his papers and everything are. And I'm not sure, but I think it's something like his third or fourth poetry publication was done by the group here in something called the Illiterati. And again, they love the puns, right? Not literati, but illiterati. And so they had a lot of fun with that sort of thing. So. Henry Miller, all right, the bad boy of American literature, Tropic of Cancer, Tropic of Capricorn, Black Spring, The Rosy Crucifixion. His books were banned for 30 years in the United States and Britain because he spoke, shall we say, frankly about sex. And he lived in Big Sur, south of the Bay Area. And Bill Everson knew Henry Miller. He met him through the librarian I mentioned earlier, Lawrence Clark Powell. And Everson knew Miller. He wrote to him after the fine arts started. He said, Henry, will you come up and be the head of the fine arts group? And I thought, well, that's interesting. And so Miller, I saw the letter exchanged, and I read the letters, and Miller very politely declined. And he said, I'm just too busy. And he was very much an individual, if you're familiar with him at all. And he said, quote, I'd soon prove to be a thorn in everybody's side. And so he decided he couldn't make it up. But I love to think what would have happened if Henry Miller had come up to Walport. Okay? Henry Miller was the sort of like the godfather of the whole 50s and 60s scene in San Francisco. Jack Kerouac wanted to make a pilgrimage to go see him. All these young people in the 60s were going down to Big Sur to see the master, Henry Miller. And I like to imagine what had happened if he had come up to Walport. And what if he had liked it? And what if he had stayed? And all the people streaming out of San Francisco are not going south down to Big Sur, but they're coming north up to Yachats and Walport. Imagine what would have happened if the 60s had come up here, okay? Yeah, they did in the 70s, right? Yeah. And so it's just a marvelous scene. I just try to imagine Henry Miller. What would he have done up here? So. Kenneth Patchen. How many of you are familiar with Kenneth Patchen? Just a few, yeah. I didn't know much about it. Quite a few, yeah. He was a fiery anti-war poet, if you can imagine such a thing. He was crippled. His back was caused him great pain and great discomfort, so he couldn't go into the service. But he had always been against the war, and he wrote some very, very powerful poems against the war. And he's published by New Directions. Some of you may be familiar with that. And really, New Directions was the vanguard of all the new writing and art from the middle of the 50th century. James Laughlin, heir to the Laughlin steel fortune, and his family said, you can have all the money, but just don't cause any trouble. So he went out and created a publishing empire. So Patchen, they got in touch with Patchen and said, you want to send some poems? And Patchen said, yeah, okay. He said, I'll send you some poems. In fact, I'm going to send you a book of poems on one condition. Any profits that you make from sales have to go back into your operation. And that really got my attention. Here's a poet, right, who doesn't have much money anyway, right, saying, look, I don't want any money. I want you to put it back into your operation to keep this thing going. Well, this is the book that they published called An Astonished Eye Looks Out of the Air. And this was published up at Camp Angell in 1945. And I'll talk more about it in a second. Well, after the war, a number of them went down to San Francisco. They got involved in the scenes down there. Kermit Sheets, Adrian Wilson, and a group of others founded the Interplayers, as I mentioned earlier. And that was a groundbreaking theater group that was really, really on the forefront and really, really, really opened the doors for a lot of what came after. The San Francisco theater scene that really blossomed in the 60s, all right, that all started with these guys, the Interplayers. Bill Everson in particular, he got to know Kenneth Rexroth, met him through Lawrence Clark Powell and Henry Miller, and visited with Rexroth, and Rexroth said, I want to create a renaissance here in San Francisco. And he wanted to do it with William Everson and a guy named Philip LaMancha, who was considered a young poetic genius, sort of a young American Rimbaud. I think he was 15 years old when he first got published. And Robert Duncan, who was over in Berkeley. And here's Rexroth later on, once things got going, doing the poetry and jazz of the Blackhawks. Some of you may even have heard this record. Anybody own it? No? Okay. Rexroth, Robert Duncan, okay, the scene's starting to come together, and this got leading to that thing we call the San Francisco Renaissance, bringing us such icons as Lawrence Ferlinghetti's City Lights Bookstore, celebrating Jack Kerouac, author of On the Road, Allen Ginsberg, whose long poem Howl changed everything. Do you notice any resemblance? Lawrence Ferlinghetti is 95 years old, still living in San Francisco, not far from City Lights, and I was able to get through to him via email, and he told me that Patchen sent him, or gave him, a copy of The Astonished Eye, And he loved the idea so much that when he started his own publishing empire, the Pocket Poets series in 1953, he stole the design. And this is now the iconic design, right, known throughout the world. This is the City Lights Pocket Poets design, and it was created just up the street. Well, all of this inspired a young author from Springfield named Ken Kesey, who decided that he was going to go down to San Francisco to become a beatnik, but he quickly realized that wasn't going to work out. So he ended up going into graduate school at Stanford, where he's writing a book called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and he ended up needing some money, so he volunteered to be a guinea pig for a medical experiment where they gave him LSD, and he thought that was pretty cool, so he decided to share it with everybody, and he put together his group called the Merry Pranksters. They drove across the country. They put together. Do I really need to tell you guys what this is? No, I think we're all on board, right? Acid test, the creative happenings, leading our way to San Francisco's Be-Ins and the Golden Gate Parks, okay, and the Summer of Love. Now, I am not saying the Summer of Love began in Walport in 1945. Although you can notice some similarities. Let's flip back. Let's go to one. No, let's go forward. Yeah. You can notice some similarities in some of the work. This is Kemper Naumann painting Glenn Caulfield in 1944. Let's flip back. All right, there's the flow. Okay. So, seriously, there's a deep current running here. Not only were members of Camp Angell in their creative acts and holding true to their ideals, not only were they plowing the ground for a new sensibility, for a deeper understanding of the relationship between those unbelievably complicated things called war and peace. Let's go back. All right. But also, as the subtitle indicates, right, how it moves from the margins to the mainstream, they were really preparing the way for a new generation of young people facing a war of their own in Vietnam. And they would then populate the massive peace movements of the 1960s. And I don't think I need to explain this photograph to this crowd, do I? I don't think I need to explain this guy either. John Lennon, there he is at his bed in, remember that? 1969, Montreal Hotel, and there he is he and Yoko in bed, for a week. All the TV cameras there, the radio, all the press are there, and they're saying, John, tell us what this means. What's going on? And John says, well, I'll tell you what it means. He says, what you want to do is, and I think I got a quote, I've got it memorized. He says, what you want to do is stay in bed for peace. Grow your hair for peace. Do something like that can't be got, can't be smashed. Which brings us full circle back to that first photo I showed you. I found out in my research that Glenn Caulfield was not a madman. He wasn't a lunatic poet. He wasn't hygienically challenged. Glenn Caulfield, for 1 year at an isolated work camp on the Oregon coast, refused to cut his hair or shave in protest. He was growing his hair for peace. I want to close with a very brief excerpt of a letter written by Bill Everson. And he was really the leader of Camp Angell. And he was writing, this was after Camp Angell closed. What happened is, the guys were in the camps. They had to be for the duration of the war plus 6 months. And legitimately so. So the whole point was that they could not have people, right, 13 million people in the military, right? They couldn't have them being released from the military looking for work while the COs were coming out at a higher percentage. So there'd be thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of people released from the military, then there'd be 60 people released from the CPS camps, right, percentage ratio. So this is Camp Angell closed in December 1945, and they moved the people who hadn't been released yet to the other CO camp, which is up at Cascade Locks, up the Columbia, east of Portland. So they moved everything on up there. The printer, the whole business, they moved it all up there. And Everson is writing to his friend, Lawrence Clark Powell, the librarian down at UCLA. And so he's writing on this cold January night in 1946. And he says, "Tonight I sit in the press room, or what will someday be a press room, alone, the rain on the roof, the litter about me of all the untied books and equipment, and I nurse inside me a song for Walport, a dirge, a lamentation, for my heart is there, on the beach, where the breakers are grinding their immemorial wheels upon the sand." And he said, it's only when you leave the special places that you realize how special they were. And he thought about the other camps. And there were other camps that did artistic work. They were creative. But he said it was more in the way of a hobby or an indulgence. And he said, yes, the other camps were liberal. But Walport, he said, Walport was radical. And I quote, "There were men there, and they saw to the heart of the pure creative substance, the rock, and they began cutting to it, and they hewed off layer after layer of incidentals, and they got to the heart of it, stripped it down, made it shine. They made it shine in painting, in music, in drama, and in writing, and nothing else really mattered. We called it the fine arts at Walport, and it is dead. And the great years of my life lie there with it, and I'm proud of my part, proud to be of those clean men, and to have done what I did, and built, not be satisfied with sitting on my ass." Well, he said, you can't go back. You create out of the inexplicable substance of experience as it's loaded into your lap by the guy who operates the celestial garbage wagon. There are poems to be written, books to be printed, and there's no weeping over the past, but let us at least salute it. Walport. Everybody, I know you've been sitting a little while. It's a wonderful story to share. I'd be happy to answer any questions, take comments. I'm sure there's things. Yes, sir.
Was the CCC camp down in Cape Perpetua ever a part of this?
I'm glad you asked that. He asked, was the CCC camp down at Cape Perpetua ever a part of this? Yes and no. The original CCC camp was at Cape Perpetua, and then they moved it up to the Walport space. And I actually have seen some photos where while they were in the CPS camp, they went down to what remained of the Cape Perpetua camp and were pulling boards off. I mean, this was early recycling, you know? And they were pulling the boards off of the buildings and then and moving it up here. So technically, that camp was not part of it, but the relationship was certainly there. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I knew Jim Gallahan.
Oh, yeah.
Wasn't he really instrumental in helping them set up the press? Isn't that him? Yeah. My particular interest was in World War II aircraft recognition, so I went up to him and I said, well, so did you guys have anything to do with the towers? And he said, well, not really. I said, well, what happened? He said, well, they got us to work, and they showed us this tower, and his buddy Howard said, well, what are you going to do with this tower? He said, well, we're going to look for enemy aircraft. And they all put their shovels down, turned around and walked out.
Yeah. Did you guys hear what he said? I can share a short version of it. Wonderful story. First, he mentioned Jim Gallahan. That's the guy standing there with the hat up there on the left. Great guy. I got to interview him, actually, before he died. He was living in Monroe. He died just a couple years ago. And Jim Gallahan was a welder who sang opera. Unbelievable character. He was just, he would walk around camp at night and he would be belting out, right, expletives in Italian. And he would be singing out, and he was just an unbelievable character. He was a boat builder. After the war, he worked in the mills, he made violins, he did all kinds of stuff. You know much more than I do. But you were telling the story about the fire lookouts, and this is something that's in the book. There's so many stories that I'm just gave you an overview, okay? There's tons more. Well, at one point, they were asked to build fire lookouts. And they said, okay, well, that's good. We want to stop fires, you know. And so they went out to put that together. And they said, well, okay, so, and then some other people were around, and there was a couple lookouts they were starting to build. And they said, well, these are also going to be used by the AWS, the Air Warning Service. And these were volunteers who went to various places, and they all had books showing the silhouettes of Japanese planes and everything. And they said, we will look for the enemy planes. And the CEO said, well, no, wait a second. We're not going to build something for the war effort. They said, oh, no, you're not doing it for the war effort. You're doing it for the fires. They said, well, no, wait a second. All right? If we want us to do something for the fires, we'll use it for fires. You want to look for enemy aircraft, you go build your own towers, right? And that's what you're saying where Gallahan said they just put their shovels down. They said, and this stuff was happening all the time. There was always these big discussions, and it drove the supervisors crazy because they had kind of a military perspective, right? Okay, I'm your leader, you do this, go out and do it, right? And these guys would say, well, we're certainly willing to do that, but let's examine the reasons behind. And this would go on and on and on, and it would just drive them crazy. Yeah, I saw another question here somewhere.
I was wondering how the townspeople reacted.
Exactly, yeah. There's quite a bit of that in the book as well. The way the townspeople reacted in general was pretty much what you would expect, right? It's your standard bell curve. There were some people who were heavily against them, some people who thought what they were doing was really important, and the vast majority really just, generally tolerated them, didn't want to have a whole lot to do with them. You got to keep in mind what it was like back then. We had Walport 4 miles to the north with 600 people. We had Yachats 2 miles to the south with 200 people. We'd just been through 10 years of a Great Depression, okay? So there was really no business going on. Then the war comes in, rationing, gasoline rationing, rubber rationing, blackouts at night. There wasn't a whole lot of travel up and down. If any of you grew up at that time, I'm sure you remember. There wasn't a whole lot of interaction going on. One key thing that did happen, I think, that really helped with the townspeople, which was they'd just been through 10 years of a depression, right? So suddenly there's a camp that has 100 plus people, right? They need food, they need supplies, they need, and back then you needed some meat. What did you do? You went to the local farmers or the local people and you found some animals and you butchered them. Eggs and vegetables and all those things. And they bought dairy, right? They bought them from the locals. So that helped. Specifically, what would happen is that there were a number of people who really didn't care much for what was going on at all. There's a number of real funny stories now. One night, they had the Camp Walport sign, and one night somebody came by and painted out Walport and wrote coward. And to give you an idea of how the COs viewed that kind of treatment, I read one of the guy's diaries, and he reported that incident, and he said, somebody did that, it was probably, some of the local kids. He says, not very bright, though. They weren't smart enough to use yellow paint, because they had painted it in red. The Lincoln County Times, is that what you were going to mention? The editor, the Lincoln County Times? The editor of the Lincoln County Times really is a weekly newspaper out of Walport, and he really took a disliking to the group. And he wrote some scathing editorials. He had, did anybody know Dave Hall? Any relation? Dave Hall? Somebody told me that some of his descendants are still here. And so he had a very idiosyncratic spelling and typography style, and he used lots and lots of exclamation marks and misspellings and things. But he took a disliking to them. Some say because the press that they bought was actually something that he had part ownership in, and he had owed money to his partner, and his partner said, you can sell that press to anybody except Dave Hall. And so there's all this rumor stuff. That's the thing about this story. At almost every level, you'll find, here's a fact, and here's its refutation. And I was triangulating information all the time, trying to say, okay, what really happened? So, you can read Dave Hall's stuff, it's on the internet now, I guess, but I was looking at it in the microfilm. Cap's Roadhouse, does that sound familiar to anybody?
Yeah.
Yeah. Bob Welch interviewed me when the book first came out, and I was talking with him. And as many of you know, Bob his family's had a cabin here for decades. And I'm sitting in the Register Guard building talking to Bob, and he says, "Caps!" And he knew exactly what it was. Well, there was a story that I explored quite deeply in the book. It was a New Year's Eve, I think in 1944, 45. They're at Caps Roadhouse, and they're dancing. And some of the CEOs and their wives, because some of them did have their wives there, and some of their girlfriends would come visit. And they were dancing, and the band started playing the fast numbers, so they started jitterbugging. And so Dave Hall writes in the following week, he calls them the Conscientious Jitterbuggers, and he got all upset about it, and he actually got Walter Winchell to say something on his weekly program, okay? And you guys know Walter Winchell was the person. Every Sunday night, all across the country, everybody's listening to Walter Winchell. And I wasn't able to track down the actual broadcast. I couldn't get that, but I got enough quotes of it. And he said something like, "Attention, Portland editors, check with editor of Wallport paper for subversive activities at Conchi Camp there," And so that kind of stuff was going on. So hitchhiking was very, very common. So there was lots of hitchhiking going on, and I got stories of how the guys would be hitchhiking to Eugene or Corvallis or Portland, because they would get furloughs. And then people would start talking to them. Sometimes they get dumped off on the road. Sometimes they'd say, "Wow, I didn't know about that. Tell me more." So there was a mix. Yeah.
My sense is it was much tougher for COs that are outside. They didn't have the social support created that way.
Absolutely.
My brother was a CO in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And he had stories, a lot of stories.
Yeah.
Flat out truth.
Exactly. Yeah, he just mentioned, he said his brother was a CO during World War II, and his sense is that it was much tougher for people outside the camps. Yes, I think that while this area, again, people, we're not very nice. I mean, some people would, there's one story where they went roller skating one time, and some kids were trying to trip them, stuff like that. Manch told a story. She was in town, and a couple of women stood up and blocked her way, and they said, "Why didn't you join the WWII, right, the Women's Army Corps? Why didn't you join the WWII?" And Manch looked at them and said, "I don't want to." And they didn't know how to respond to that, And but yeah, in other parts of the country, do you remember where your brother was? South Dakota, yeah, okay. In other parts of the country, things were really tough. William Stafford, Down in My Heart, the opening story in the book Down in My Heart tells about being in Arkansas and how 3 of them on a Sunday, I see your heads nodding, you know what I'm talking about. How 3 of them on a Sunday afternoon, one guy was writing poems, another guy was painting, and another guy was just sitting reading a book. And they were accosted by the locals, and they weren't sure they were going to get away alive. Yeah, so in some areas it was pretty tough. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I find it fascinating that they left the area, the ones that you spoke about, and went to San Francisco to flower, in essence, to do their thing.
Right.
Isn't that today presently the same feeling? You get out of here and go to someplace where you can do activity.
Exactly. Yeah. What he says is interesting that they went to San Francisco where they could go really do their thing, right? And he says, isn't that, yes, it's timeless, I think is your point, and I would agree with you. It's what I did. I grew up on the East Coast, and I was working for a factory job, and and I saw all my friends, and their parents were so old; they were 45, but really, their backs, and I took a look, and I said, "Dear Lord, I can't do this." So I ran as far away as I could. I was heading for Bellingham, Washington, and I made it to Corvallis. And I'm sure that many of us could share that story, right? Yes, it's a timeless story. Absolutely. Yeah, let's get out of here and go someplace where we can make something happen. Yeah. But what I do find interesting is that because they knew that they weren't going to be here forever, they made something happen here too. They made it happen here. And what I didn't really go into detail about is what happened is, does anybody know that there were actually 2 attempts at the San Francisco Renaissance? Kenneth Rexroth, right? Many of us know about this San Francisco beat thing that happened in the 50s with Kerouac and Ginsberg. Not really. Rexroth actually tried to make it happen in the late 40s with Bill Everson, Philip LaMantia, and Robert Duncan. And he saw, and he wrote these things in London and New York journals, and he says, this is where it's happening, and it didn't take. And so they retooled, and they went for it again. Yes, sir?
I think Duncan saw the San Francisco Renaissance more at Berkeley and it's separate from the beat poets. They all knew each other.
True.
But Duncan and Spicer and the third one, I can't think of his name, that was going on there at the same time as what City Lights was going on.
Exactly, yeah. And I quote Everson in here. Rexroth is really funny. He said that Ginsberg was an academic bore before he came to San Francisco. And San Francisco freed him to write Howl. And I quote Everson in here. He was talking in the 60s, and he said what was happening in San Francisco in the early 50s, because that's when the New York Beats came. And the New York Beats were looking for a place where what they were trying to do would take hold, because it wasn't happening so much for them in New York either. It was just that scene in the Greenwich Village area. And Everson says what happened is that they came to San Francisco and found themselves. And their finding of themselves allowed us to find ourselves, and the whole thing just took off. Yeah, okay.
You mentioned at the beginning of your talk that there were 50,000 conscientious objectors in the country, but only 25 of them were allowed to stay out of combat duties,
Right.
and then 12 of those went into these camps. So what did it take to qualify in the eyes of the military as a conscientious objector?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. He says, what did it take? Because there were 50,000 conscientious objectors. Half of them went into non-combat service, and then just half of them went into CPS. So what did it take? It was not like Vietnam. It was, or in some ways it might have been, it really came down to the local draft board. It really did. I actually went to the Swarthmore Peace Collection at Swarthmore College outside of Philadelphia, where all the NSBRO records are, the National Service Board of Religious Objectors. This is where all the records are, and I read many of the forms that people filled out for the selective service. And what it was your local draft board. They decided. And they decided that either you would go to prison, you were allowed in CPS, you could just go home. And I quote Everson in here, said it was known that in some parts of Berkeley, depending on where the line was, you could live on this side of the street and you'd go home or to CPS. The other side of the street, you go to prison. And that's what it was. Yes, ma'am.
My family were brethren, and my brother was a conscientious objector, as well as some uncles and brother-in-law. And back there in the East, you had to either belong to one of the peace churches that you said, or be able to show a very clear history
Exactly.
of peace activities.
Yeah, that's it. And she says, in some areas that's very true. You had to be a member of one of the peace churches. And that's actually was the case during World War I. And in some places that was in fact true. It depended on the draft board. World War II was the first time where they began to recognize political and philosophical objectors. And I actually have sort of a concise history of this whole thing as chapter 2 in the book. And that's where I really learned a lot and immersed myself in the history of how conscientious objectors were treated in this country. And during World War II, the Selective Service had 19 categories, and some of them are hilarious, and I list them in the book. There's one category, I can't remember exactly what it is, some kind of phobia. It's an aversion to blood. And that was one of the categories, and so they had those. But it depended on the local draft board. Many of them were World War I vets. Many of them were really, really quite patriotic, in that way, which is, what do you mean you're not going to go to this war, So yeah, it was really just a matter of, luck of where you were.
We have a sort of a volunteer military system now, right? And yes, but
Well, it all depends on how you look at it, right? I teach at a community college, and I got a lot of vets in my classes, and I know that they volunteered, but what do you do when where you live and what you have is basically the equivalent of a prison or death? Sorry, I just gave out my political sensibilities, didn't I? I am not a fan of class war. Yes.
What happens now when somebody goes into the service and they decide to be a conscientious
Mhm.
objector? What happens to them?
Yeah, I can't answer that with real authority because it's happening now, and there's a lot of that going on. There's actually books, and I think there was a show on Frontline not too long ago about current conscientious objection at PBS's Frontline. You can go online and find all of this stuff. What happens now, to the best of my knowledge, is they get as much help as they can from the current version of the War Resisters League, which is now called what? The name escapes me off the top of my head. But there are Iraq War conscientious objectors, male and female, and there are stories about them out there, and you can find that online pretty easily. I think it's some variation of some combination of legal navigation. Yeah. You know, because really what they're talking about is saying, no, I don't want to be drafted. They're saying, yes, I enlisted and now I want out. So that's a different animal. But it is happening, and people are being recognized. People have become conscientious objectors, and you could just type in a search engine and you could get that information pretty quickly. But yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have all that in my head right now. It's very complex, very complex. Yeah. Thank you very much, everybody.